Sweat and arrogance choked the air at Iron Apex. Trent thought the old man holding a mop was just another punching bag. "I will break you," the champion sneered. He didn't know the quiet janitor had survived horrors Trent couldn't even fathom. The next 3 minutes changed the gym forever. Neon signs buzzed outside the frosted windows of Iron Apex, casting a sick, flickering green light over the damp pavement. Inside, the air hung heavy. It tasted of metallic iron, stale sweat, and peeling vinyl. It was a sanctuary for the violent, a playground for the vain. In the corner, methodically pushing a gray mop across the black interlocking mats, was Frank. Nobody really saw Frank. In a room full of inflated egos and mirror-checked muscles, a man pushing 60 in a faded olive drab surplus jacket might as well have been a ghost. He lived in a rusted Ford Econoline, parked in the alley out back. Ben, the gym owner, let him sleep there and run the mop in exchange for $50 a week and unrestricted access to the hot showers. It was a transaction of pity, but Frank didn't mind. Pity was quiet. Pity left him alone. Frank moved with a stiff, deliberate rhythm. His left knee ground like unoiled gears with every step, a lingering souvenir from a dusty road outside Fallujah 2 decades prior. His hands, gripping the wooden handle of the mop, were maps of scar tissue and thickened calluses. They were hands that had built shelters, fired rifles, and held bleeding friends. Now they wrung out dirty water into a yellow plastic bucket. He preferred it this way. The bucket didn't scream. Across the gym, the heavy bags were taking a beating, but one sound cut through the ambient noise like a serrated knife. It was the sharp, explosive thwack of shin bone against leather. Trent was holding court. At 24, Trent was the gym's prize stallion and its biggest liability. He was a local kickboxing phenom with a pristine amateur record, a blue check mark on social media, and a personality that could curdle fresh milk. He was built like a Greek statue and possessed the humility of a warlord. Tonight, he was sparring. Or rather, he was bullying. "Keep your hands up, Toby. Come on. You're moving like a pregnant cow," Trent barked, his voice echoing off the high tin ceiling. Toby, a college kid with a soft midsection who just wanted to lose some weight, was backed against the cage, gasping for air. His headgear was knocked askew. Trent didn't let up. He threw a lightning-fast combination, jab, cross, and a vicious liver kick that folded Toby in half. Toby dropped to the canvas wheezing, clutching his side. Trent didn't check on him. He simply strutted away, bouncing on his toes, rolling his shoulders to the bass-heavy rap music pumping from the overhead speakers. He glanced at the wall-to-wall mirrors, running a gloved hand over his close-cropped fade. He was feeding on the attention. The other gym members watched, some in awe, others in silent, cowardly disgust. No one said a word. Trent paid his dues, and more importantly, he brought in new sign-ups. Frank paused his mopping. He rested his chin on his hands atop the mop handle, his faded blue eyes tracking Trent's movements. He wasn't watching the strut, he was analyzing the mechanics. Trent was fast, undeniably. His fast twitch muscles were primed, his aggression off the charts. But he was sloppy. He fought on emotion, dropping his right hand a full 3 inches every time he loaded up a left hook. He threw naked kicks without setting them up. In a ring with a referee, it was enough to win. In an alley, it was enough to get him killed. Frank went back to his mop. It wasn't his circus. It wasn't his monkeys. He pushed the soapy water toward the edge of the sparring area. Trent, still hyped on adrenaline and seeking an outlet for his manufactured rage, paced toward the water cooler. He unscrewed the cap of his expensive electrolyte drink, took a massive swig, and intentionally spat a mouthful onto the floor Frank had just cleaned. The wet splat echoed loudly during a lull in the music. Frank stopped. He looked at the puddle. He looked up at Trent. "Missed the trash can," Frank said. His voice was a low gravel, quiet but carrying a strange acoustic weight that cut through the gym's hum. Trent turned, his eyes narrowing. He looked Frank up and down, the scuffed boots, the frayed jacket, the gray beard. He smirked, sensing an easy target to elevate his alpha status. I pay $200 a month to train here, old man. You get paid in loose change to clean up my mess, so clean it. The floor is clean, Frank replied softly, his face an unreadable mask. You made it dirty. Have some respect. A few guys hitting the speed bag stopped. The rhythmic tapping ceased. The silence spread outward from the water cooler like a ripple in a pond. Trent laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He stepped fully onto the wet spot, tracking it across the dry mat. Respect? You're a bum, dude. You live in a van that smells like cat piss. Don't talk to me about respect. Just mop the floor before I make you lick it up. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't puff out his chest. He simply leaned slightly against the wooden pole. You drop your right hand when you throw the left, Frank said. The observation entirely detached, clinical. You pull your chin up when you kick. You fight like a kid who's never been hit in the mouth. Trent's smirk vanished. The insult to his technique pierced his ego far deeper than any insult to his character. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He threw his water bottle against the wall. It shattered, spraying pink liquid everywhere. What did you say to me, you homeless piece of trash? Trent hissed, closing the distance. He stood inches from Frank, towering over the older man. I said, Frank murmured, his eyes locking onto Trent's with the cold, dead certainty of a man who had stared into the abyss. You have bad habits, and bad habits get you hurt. Trent's chest heaved. Put the mop down, right now. I will break you. I swear to God, I will break every brittle bone in your pathetic body. Silence swallowed Iron Apex. The heavy bass from the speakers suddenly felt intrusive, irrelevant. 20 sets of eyes were glued to the water cooler. Ben, the manager, came jogging out from the back office, a clipboard clutched to his chest. He saw the shattered bottle, the posturing champion, and the motionless janitor. Whoa, Trent, back off, man. He's just doing his job. Ben stepped between them, holding a hand up to Trent's chest. Trent shoved Ben's hand away. He's disrespecting me, Ben, in my gym. This bum is telling me how to fight. He's an old man, Trent. Leave it alone, Ben pleaded, casting a nervous glance at Frank. Ben only knew Frank as the quiet guy who'd once paid for a broken taillight with a jar of pennies. He didn't want the man killed on his watch. Frank slowly reached out and placed his hand on Ben's shoulder. The grip was shockingly firm. It's all right, Ben, Frank said quietly. Let him vent. Vent? Trent spat, the veins bulging in his neck. Step on the mat right now, unless you're nothing but talk. Step on the damn mat, Granddad. Frank looked at the elevated sparring ring. It was a pristine square of blue canvas bathed in harsh overhead halogens. He hadn't stepped onto a mat in anger in over 15 years. He looked back at Trent. The boy was trembling with rage, vibrating with an insecure need to dominate. Frank recognized that anger. It was the same hollow fury he used to see in young recruits who thought war was an action movie, right before the first mortar shell dropped and reality fractured their minds. Frank let go of the mop. It hit the floor with a hollow wooden clatter. He reached up and unbuttoned his olive drab jacket. Underneath, he wore a simple, faded gray t-shirt. His arms were lean, sinewy, wrapped in thick bands of muscle that looked like twisted steel cables. Faded ink crawled up his right forearm, a military unit insignia, barely recognizable beneath a jagged, puckered burn scar. He walked slowly toward the edge of the mat. He sat down on the apron and began unlacing his heavy steel-toed work boots. Frank, you don't have to do this, Ben whispered, leaning in. He'll hurt you. He doesn't know when to stop. I know, Frank said softly, pulling off his socks. His feet were battered, the joints thick. Neither do I. Frank stood up and stepped over the ropes. He didn't bounce. He didn't shadow box. He walked to the center of the ring and stood perfectly still. His feet were planted flat, shoulder-width apart, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He looked entirely vulnerable, yet completely immovable. Trent vaulted over the top rope, landing with a loud thud to announce his presence. He was already wearing 16-ounce sparring gloves and shin pads. He tapped his gloves together. A menacing smack. His eyes burned holes into Frank. "No rounds, no ref," Trent growled, pacing back and forth like a caged tiger. "You tap or you sleep." Frank just blinked. "Whenever you're ready, son." Trent didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward with the explosive speed of a thoroughbred. He closed the gap in a fraction of a second, throwing a massive, looping overhand right, aimed squarely at Frank's jaw. It was a knockout punch thrown with enough torque to decapitate a heavy bag. Frank didn't step back. Stepping back was a civilian instinct. Instead, Frank stepped in. He slid his left foot forward, dropping his center of gravity. As Trent's massive arm swung through the space where Frank's head had been a millisecond before, Frank raised his left forearm to check Trent's bicep, neutralizing the momentum. The gym echoed with the meaty smack of flesh on flesh. Trent was entirely off balance, his momentum carrying him past his target. His eyes widened in momentary confusion. Frank pivoted cleanly. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't need to. He simply placed his calloused palm against the back of Trent's neck and used the boy's own violent inertia against him. He gave a sharp downward shove. Trent flew forward, his face burying into the blue canvas with a violent skid. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen out of the room. Toby, still nursing his ribs by the cage, let out a low whistle. Trent scrambled to his feet, his nose burning from the mat burn, his humiliation instantly morphing into blinding rage. He abandoned all pretense of technique. He charged with a flurry of wild punches, lefts, rights, uppercuts. Frank remained a ghost. He slipped a jab by turning his chin. He parried a heavy cross with a subtle flick of his wrist. He absorbed a glancing hook on his shoulder by rolling with the impact. Frank's movements were violently economical. He wasn't wasting a single breath or an ounce of energy. He looked like an old oak tree, weathering a frantic, meaningless storm. "Fight back, you coward!" Trent screamed, his lungs starting to burn. He threw a devastating high roundhouse kick, aiming for Frank's temple. Frank saw the tell. He saw Trent's shoulder dip, saw the hips open up. Instead of blocking the powerful leg, Frank took a half step forward and jammed it. He caught Trent's thigh on the inside with the point of his knee. A sickening, dull thwack echoed through the gym. It was the sound of a nerve taking a direct, paralyzing hit. Trent's leg went completely dead. He collapsed onto his side, screaming, clutching his thigh. He tried to stand, but his leg folded underneath him like wet cardboard. He hit the canvas again, his face pale, sweat pouring down his forehead. Frank stood over him. He hadn't thrown a single closed fist punch. He hadn't even broken a sweat. His breathing was as slow and rhythmic as the ocean. Frank looked down at the trembling champion. The arrogance had been wiped clean, replaced by raw, unfiltered shock. "Like I said," Frank murmured, the entire gym straining in silence to hear his voice. "Bad habits. Pain is an excellent teacher, but ego is a stubborn student." Trent lay on his side, his face pressed against the damp blue vinyl of the sparring mat. The harsh overhead halogens burned into his retinas. His right leg was completely numb from the mid-thigh down, save for a searing electric throb radiating from the cluster of nerves Frank had just systematically dismantled. The gym was so quiet, Trent could hear the erratic, shallow wheeze of his own panicked breathing. He looked at the crowd. The guys who usually hyped him up, the ones who carried his water, filmed his sparring sessions for social media, and laughed at his cruel jokes, were staring at him with wide, unrecognizable expressions. It wasn't pity. It was shock. The illusion of his invincibility had shattered, and the jagged pieces were scattered all over the canvas. Trent ground his teeth together. The metallic taste of blood seeped onto his tongue from where he had bitten his own cheek during the fall. He refused to let it end like this. He was a champion. He was 24. He was in his prime. The man standing over him was a decrepit vagrant who smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. "I'm not done!" Trent gasped, his voice cracking. He pushed himself up with his arms. His right leg dragged behind him like a useless anchor. He looked ridiculous, half crawling, half staggering. Frank watched him rise. The older man didn't shift his stance. He didn't raise his hands to guard his face. He simply watched, his eyes reflecting a profound, weary sadness. It was the look of a man who had seen too much pointless violence and was exhausted by the human compulsion to bleed for pride. "Stay down, kid," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got nothing to prove to me. They don't care about you." He gestured slightly toward the silent onlookers. Trent let out a primal, guttural scream. It was a sound devoid of technique, fueled entirely by humiliation. He lunged forward off his good leg, throwing a wild, desperate overhand right. He didn't want to win a sparring match anymore. He wanted to take Frank's head off. He wanted to erase the last 60 seconds from existence. Frank sighed. It was a small, tragic sound. As Trent's fist flew through the air, Frank simply stepped off the center line. He didn't block. He let the massive punch sail harmlessly past his left ear. The momentum carried Trent forward, completely off balance and wholly exposed. Frank moved with terrifying fluidity. He slipped his left arm under Trent's right armpit, wrapping his hand securely behind the boy's neck in a textbook underhook. With his right hand, he grabbed Trent's tricep. Frank didn't muscle him down. He just stepped his right foot back and dropped his hips. The physics were undeniable. Trent was pulled face first toward the mat again, but this time, Frank went with him. Before Trent even realized he was falling, Frank had smoothly transitioned to his back. The older man's heavy, unyielding hips pressed Trent flat against the canvas. The air was violently forced from Trent's lungs in a loud, wet whoosh. Panic seized Trent. He thrashed, trying to roll, trying to buck the weight off his back. He was used to grappling with guys his own age, guys who used explosive power and fast twitch muscles. Frank felt different. Frank felt like a concrete slab. There was no space to move. Every time Trent tried to shrimp his hips or frame with his arms, Frank was already there, shutting down the escape route before Trent even fully committed to it. It was a suffocating dominance. Frank slid his thick, calloused right forearm under Trent's chin. Trent's eyes bulged. He brought both of his gloved hands up, desperately clawing at Frank's arm, trying to peel it away from his throat, but the old man's arm was locked in place like an iron bar. Frank didn't squeeze. He didn't crank the neck. He simply secured the grip, connecting his right hand to his left bicep, and pressed his cheek flat against the back of Trent's head. "Stop fighting," Frank murmured, his voice a low vibration, right against Trent's ear. Trent kicked his good leg. He twisted. He gurgled, a pathetic sound, like a drowning man fighting the tide. The heavy 16-ounce gloves made it impossible for him to get a grip on Frank's wrist. Frank locked his legs in a tight body triangle around Trent's ribs. The pressure was immense. It compressed Trent's diaphragm, restricting his breathing to short, panicked sips of air. "Look at me," Frank commanded softly. Trent couldn't turn his head, but his eyes darted to the mirrored wall across the gym. He saw the reflection. He saw himself trapped, broken, helpless beneath the janitor he had spat on. "You fight for cameras," Frank whispered, his tone devoid of malice, but heavy with cold reality. "You fight for cheers. You fight to stroke your own ego. That makes you weak." Frank tightened the choke just a fraction of an inch, just enough to let Trent feel the abyss yawning open beneath him. The blood flow to Trent's brain began to restrict. The edges of his vision blurred, turning a fuzzy, static gray. The loud pulsing of his own heart hammered in his eardrums. "If we were in an alley," Frank said steadily, "if this was for your life, you'd be gone by now. Your pride is going to get you killed, son." The gray at the edge of Trent's vision bled inward. The panic peaked, then abruptly shattered into absolute terror. He realized, with sudden crystal clarity, that Frank held his life completely in his hands. This wasn't a game. There was no referee to jump in. There was only the mercy of the man he had abused. Trent's gloved hand slapped the blue canvas. Tap, tap, tap. It was frantic, desperate. Frank released the choke instantly. He didn't hold it for an extra second to prove a point. He uncrossed his legs and rolled smoothly off Trent's back, standing up in one fluid motion without using his hands. Trent stayed on his hands and knees. He coughed violently, hacking up a string of thick saliva onto the mat. He was crying. The tears mixed with his sweat and dropped onto the vinyl. It was an ugly, broken sound. The sound of a shattered reality. Frank didn't look down at him. He didn't raise his arms in victory. He simply walked to the edge of the mat, sat down, and began to lace up his scuffed, steel-toed boots. The silence persisted, thick and suffocating, broken only by Trent's ragged coughing. Ben, the gym owner, stood frozen near the front desk, his clipboard dangling loosely from his fingertips. Toby, still clutching his ribs, stared at Frank with a mixture of reverence and lingering fear. No one reached for their phones. No one dared to film. The atmosphere in Iron Apex had fundamentally altered. The cheap veneer of aggression had been stripped away, exposing the raw, uncomfortable truth of real violence. Frank finished tying his left boot. He stood up, his knee giving its familiar arthritic pop. He smoothed down his faded gray t-shirt and reached for the olive-drab surplus jacket he had draped over the ring ropes. He slipped it on, buttoning it methodically, his face an unreadable mask. Trent was still on the mat. He had managed to roll onto his back, staring up at the harsh halogen lights. His chest heaved. The tears had stopped, but his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash and was only now realizing the wreckage around him was his own life. Frank stepped over the bottom rope and walked back to his yellow plastic bucket. He gripped the wooden handle of the mop. Squeak! Shh! Squeak! The sound of the wet mop against the interlocking mats cut through the dead air. Frank resumed his job exactly where he had left off. He didn't look back at the ring. He didn't look at the crowd. He pushed the soapy water in precise, overlapping arcs, eradicating the sweat and grime from the rubber flooring. Ben slowly approached the edge of the sparring area,